Hola a todos, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Mauricio Francic, soy representante de Microchip y hoy nos van a acompañar en una charla sobre FPGAs Keith Rowe, que es un ingeniero de aplicaciones de Microchip que tiene más de 25 años de experiencia en FPGAs, 15 como ingeniero de aplicaciones, y también nos va a acompañar Harold Nelson, que también tiene muchísimos años en el diseño de equipos con FPGA y ASICs como teléfonos celulares, routers, satélites y varios equipos militares. La presentación va a ser en inglés, pero cualquier consulta que quieran hacer la pueden hacer por el chat de YouTube. Vamos a estar atentos y contestarlas cuando sea pertinente. Gracias. Keith, Harold, you can go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Harold Nelson, engineer here with Microchip based in the United States in North Carolina. We're very happy to be here today, Keith and myself. And with that, I'll turn it over to Keith.
Yeah, hello, everyone. I'm Keith Rowe, similar to Harold. I'm a Microchip dedicated embedded solution engineer for the FPGA and SoC products, and we really appreciate the opportunity to share some pretty exciting information. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and start getting into the good stuff. So please let me know once it's coming through.
Okay.
Super. So today we're going to be providing a portfolio overview of all of Microchip's FPGA and SoC products, which is pretty extensive. And then we're going to be diving in a little bit to do an introduction to the latest families, the PolarFire FPGAs and PolarFire SoCs. In addition to that, Harold's put together a nice technology demo on our PolarFire imaging and video kit. And then we've compiled some getting started resources that we think will be valuable for you to get going and get streamlined to save time and reduce risk in your development efforts. And lastly, we've got some time at the end for question and answer. So towards that, we've got a lot of material to cover. And so if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we look forward to answering them at the end. So let's take a peek at the complete portfolio of FPGAs and SoCs. It's all about focus. Like many things in life, if you focus on something, you're more apt to get there. Well, Microchip is focused on creating the lowest power mid-range FPGA and SoC and hitting that target market. So as you can see on this slide, on the bottom for the FPGAs and on the top for the FPGAs and SoCs, we've got everything from the lowest density all the way up through mid-range FPGA and SoC solutions covered. And it's ironic that we're in a world now where 500,000 logic elements is considered mid-range FPGA, but that's what we've got with our PolarFire and PolarFire SoC FPGAs. Just as importantly, Microchip is leaving the other guys for what we're calling the arms race, where those FPGAs need to compete with the likes of NVIDIA and ARM for your data center and storage solutions and your high-end compute applications. I like this slide. It shows a lot of information very cleanly. On the y-axis, you'll see the approximate densities of each of the families. And on the x-axis, engineers don't care about this as much, but that's really the serviceable market for these FPGAs as estimated. So as you can see in the bottom left, we've got ultra low end CPLDs and work our way up. We still have anti-fuse FPGAs, and then we got into real FPGAs with Pro ASICs, the Igloo, and then the Smart Fusion product, which was our first hard MCU SoC that featured an ARM processor. And all of these products on all of these families shown on this slide, they're all still available to design into new products. But that being said, it's the last two blocks that I'm going to cover that are really the sweet spot. And if you're getting into any new application, it's really what you should be considering. The Igloo 2 and Smart Fusion 2 are the Gen 4 products released a few years ago. And it's a very unique structure. They provided 5 gig SerDes, but what's really cool about these, and a lot of people don't know, is that the Smart Fusion 2 is physically an Igloo 2 with the embedded processor and its associated peripherals. So you could actually, on a single circuit card, make a footprint that could support a number of Igloo 2s in a migration path, and also drop in a Smart Fusion 2 in a migration path on the same circuit. So it's pretty clever. And then there's the latest and greatest, and we'll be talking more about those shortly. And that's the PolarFire and the PolarFire SoC, where we start to get to the true current mid-range and bring our logic element count up to 500,000. We integrate 12 gig SerDes, and we now have a 5-core RISC-V core complex architecture. All these products with the same focus: power efficiency, security, and reliability optimized for mid-range. Now, those slides being done after this presentation, you're going to really want to keep a couple of key slides, and this is one of them. This is the slide that will show you all of the mainstream families that we have, that we just talked about topically, and show you their resources. So you have the families on top, and you have the primary feature sets on the left. And as you can see, for example, the logic elements in the smallest devices are 100, and they work their way up to the 500,000 in the PolarFire SoC and PolarFire devices. This also shows you the transceiver rates, whether or not they have transceivers and how fast they go, the I/O speeds, the max number of DSP resources and block RAM. And then it also shows you the processor options, where the purple items are the hard processor options and the items in black are soft implementations. And every one of these families has onboard flash that's user accessible. And there's the amounts. So before I move on to the next slide, this covers the mainstream FPGAs and SoCs from Microchip. However, it doesn't cover the complete portfolio. A lot of people aren't aware that largely through the acquisition of Microsemi and Atmel, that Microchip has a very extensive heritage in space, not just for FPGAs, but across many product portfolios. In particular to FPGAs, in 1992, we have the first FPGA screen for space. And then most recently in 2015, with the release of the RTG4, or the introduction of that product, it was the first flash FPGA with radiation hardening by design. And then this shows you a few of the platforms in which these products are flying, which I think is pretty cool. So the last slide I'm going to show you on the rad tolerant items is this product portfolio slide. I understand that for space and rad tolerant applications, they're just a small subset of the number of applications that are out there. So what we hope is that everybody on this call is simply aware that if you run into or talk to anybody that is getting into an application that requires rad tolerance, that you are aware of this portfolio. And what this slide shows you is how many different products we have in this space. The RT, SX, and SU products and the RTX products are anti-fuse devices, rad hard by design. Those cells can't be changed. Then we took two popular families, the ProASIC 3, and made a rad tolerant version, and most recently, the PolarFire FPGA, which now has a rad tolerant version. And then in the middle, you'll see really the sweet spot part. It's the RTG4. It's a winner. It's the one I just talked about before. That is the first flash rad hard by design FPGA. So that's all I'm going to say on those. And really that completes the overall portfolio view. But what we're going to do now is we're going to give you an introduction to the latest families. And that's the PolarFire FPGA and the PolarFire SoC. So there's a lot of information on this slide, and I'm going to help just distill it a little bit for you. As we talked about earlier with focus, there's 3 key markets for which these products have been developed. It doesn't mean that there's not other markets and other applications for which they're a fit. But in the area of communications, defense and aviation, and industrial applications, these are the key target markets for which they've been developed. And resultingly, there is a lot of collateral, demos, reference designs, source code available to help. And we'll talk more about some of that collateral later. So whether you're doing an edge router, a multi-access motor control, or a high-end AI, ML video application, there's collateral, and we've thought about those end applications as the products were designed so that they have the hook. But what's really important on this slide is to talk about some of the best-in-class capabilities. And there's going to be a few themes today. If there were a quiz, I would have one question and say, in what two areas, indisputably, are our FPGAs and SoCs best in class? And the answer to that quiz would be in the area of power and in the area of security and reliability, which kind of are together, but sometimes you'll see put separately. So as it says over on the right, we have the lowest power FPGA and SoCs, and I have some slides that'll show you why. It's not marketing, it's science. And then if you need a 10 gig SerDes, this is the lowest cost solution. I won't cover everything here, but know that we have defense level security, and then we have the smallest form factors. Who would have thought that now you can get 100,000 logic elements in an 11 by 11 package, which is incredible. And then let's double down. If you're willing to add 4.5 millimeters to one of those dimensions, you can get 200,000 logic elements, which is a little bit mind-blowing. It's like Moore's laws plus. All of these are SEU immune fabrics and flash-based. So when you're flash-based, that means that you don't have any configuration chip, which reduces your BOM. But in addition to that, it means that you're instant on. The device, each cell already knows its value. It doesn't have to load. It just powers up. And lastly, the goodness in flash-based is that you get really a default security because there's no bit stream to sniff on and hack. And then lastly, I'll get into, for the PolarFire SoC towards the bottom, it's a hardened MSS with RISC-Vs, which are organized in a 64-bit multi-CPU cluster and support real-time Linux and asymmetric multiprocessing and provide 2 megabytes of L3 cache. So let's slide in to PolarFire specifically. Since its inception, PolarFire has won BET award winning. It was designed to be a cost-optimized FPGA for low power, and as we mentioned, at mid-density ranges, which at that time, 150 logic elements, defined really the top end of mid-range. These provide the smallest area for high-speed IOs, have area-optimized 2.7 gig transceivers, or SerDes, support 1.6 gig LVDS, and every IO has hardened IO gearing with CDR incorporated into it, which saves resources and allows those IOs to deterministically operate faster. As far as low power goes, I'm going to be covering it a little bit more, but just keep in mind, if there was a quiz, we win the low power with the biggest advantage for static power being flash-based, as I'll show you, 10x savings, resulting in up to 50% lower cost. And then for security and reliability, simply proven and exceptional. And we'll show you some data on that later as well. So towards power, and this isn't just PolarFire FPGAs, it's also PolarFire SoCs, because PolarFire SoCs build on the PolarFire FPGAs. It's important to know that Microchip's FPGAs and SoCs are based on a non-volatile cell, and everybody else's are based on an SRAM cell. And as you probably know, SRAM needs to be continually recharged, and also those cells are leaky, which means more power. Now, this is fine for the highest end markets where you don't care about power and you're just trying to get as much as you can done. We will concede that the highest bandwidth possible are in SRAM-based FPGAs. But by picking the right non-volatile flash node, these non-volatile cells retain their states and offer 1,000x lower leakage. And as I'll show you in a little bit, that static and transceiver power advantage is where they really come in and bring the overall savings. So the last slide on power, but I really like this slide because for two main reasons. It's an honest slide. And I've been doing this role for a long time, and usually the power slides. Now, what I will tell you is if our power stunk, we wouldn't have this slide. But because it's great, we honestly show you how great it is. So the first reason that I love this slide is, as it says in bold and underline, and I'm pointing at another screen like you can see that, it says it's the best case competitor. So we've actually put the competitors in their best lights in doing this test. So that's the first reason that I like this. And then secondly is it breaks out the power. It doesn't just say, hey, we're lower power. It breaks power into the three primary buckets: your static power, your fabric or dynamic power, and then the power of the transceivers or SerDes. And as you can see, the static power has a 10x reduction and the transceiver power a 2x reduction. And that shows in the graph where you see very little green for the PolarFire devices because that 10x reduction. Similarly, the pink or magenta or whatever color that is, because I've only got primary colors, is reduced significantly. But the honesty in this slide really is in the fabric dynamic power, where you'll see that our FPGAs actually consume typically a little bit more, and sometimes as much as 2 times as much. But the net power savings because of these other two is real. So let's look at the architecture for PolarFire FPGA. In the middle, we'll start with the fabric, which is an SEU immune configuration cell and offers up to 481,000 logic elements. Part of this fabric are the multipliers, the micro block SRAM, the large block SRAM, the user PLLs and DLLs, and a user microprom. Now, I don't want to confuse you. It's kind of worth explaining. As you see, there's a little key. In the middle, in dark blue, it shows supported protocols and functions that have soft IP. As I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of focus in certain target markets. So while developing a phenomenal piece of silicon, they also made sure that there was an ecosystem of support IP for the applications in those target markets we talked about earlier. So that is not part of the fabric, but rather developed soft IP that you can incorporate. So this fabric, first we'll go to the top, connects with the up to 24 lanes of multi-protocol low power SerDes, which can operate on the low end of 250 megabits all the way up to 12.7 gigabits. And that range, high and low, is a differentiator. 12.7, as we mentioned, is differentiating for its power and the lowest cost and lowest power solution in that class of SerDes. But just as importantly, if you've ever worked with an FPGA, sometimes there's a gap between the I/O speed of general purpose I/O and transceivers. But as I said earlier, the general purpose I/O can move up to 1.6 gigabit LVDS, and the SerDes can go all the way down to 250 megabits. So that allows you flexibility on how you implement your interfaces. Next, we have off to the left. But before I discuss that, it's important to pause just for a moment. We talked about security. So every single device in these families, and also in the Igloo 2 and SmartFusion 2, come with what's called device security. And these are the features now, coming back to the diagram, that are supported by the PolarFire system controller, which manages the auto reprogramming, the puffs, secure EMDM, and all of the system services, as well as tamper detect and countermeasure implementations. So that's for device security, which is in every device. You get that for free. For a little bit more, you're not allowed to ask how much, because I'm not allowed, to talk to it. But jokes aside, each of these devices have what's called a data security version, which you can order, that incorporates the features you need to lock down, secure, and authenticate the data on the device. And those come with the hard crypto coprocessor shown here that provide the DPA resistance and the TRNGs that are used for those type of algorithms for security on your data. And lastly, you'll see that the I/O on the bottoms are broken out into high-speed I/O, which have a range of 1.2 to 1.8 volts. But then you have the general purpose I/O, which can go up to 3.3 volts and include 2.2 volt protocols. And all of those, as mentioned earlier, have the hard I/O gearing. So I mentioned that there's 3 key resources. The first one was that table that showed you all the families. The next one is for each family, you want to get the product table, because that helps you pick the right density and package. All of the items shown in green are in full production. This was the initial release of the PolarFire family. And it was so successful that really one of the only critiques that was coming back is, can we get all these same features in a lower density and therefore slightly lower cost device? And we answered this year, announcing our O50, which will be available in Q1 of next year for production. So that makes this family's logic element density go from just under 50,000 logic elements to just under the 500,000. And as you'll see, there's substantial DSP resources and math blocks. You can see the amount of large block RAMs, which are each 20K bit, and the micro SRAMs, which are really small, thus micro, 64 by 12. It also shows you here the transceiver lane count, which as mentioned goes up to 24, but every device has at least 4. And the number of PCIe Gen 2, which can operate as either an endpoint and even a root. And then you have the packages. And I'll pause a little bit here on packages, but I have one more package slide right after this that I'll go through very quick. It's really nice to know and understand migration paths. So if you look at any of these packages, like the top one, the 325 11 by 11 that we talked about, pretty incredible. Because in that package, or the 11 by 14.5, you can get a 50,000 all the way up to a 200,000 logic element device, right? Now, let's look at the next popular package, which would probably be the 19 by 19 484 pin package. It brings in a very manufacturable, friendly 0.8 pitch BGA and offers you a migration path all the way from the O50 up to the 300,000 logic element device, which means that you can put one footprint down that supports all of those densities. And that migration path is great when you're developing. So when you go into the lab and you want to save time while developing, you can put down a larger device to make sure you have all the resources that you'll need. But when you're done with the design and it's time to go to production, you can select the most cost optimized density for your production, and your board's are ready to receive it. No changes needed. There's a lot of package information here, but it's worth sharing, and it's also legitimizing. This basically shows the number and type of I/O for a given density and package, and they're broken out by temperature range. So again, all these products, except for the O50s, are in current full production. At the top, you have the extended commercial and industrial products. In the middle, the military temp range, and at the bottom, the auto and T2. So I'm not going to say much about that, but I wanted to provide it as a resource because only you know what your application requires. So now into the PolarFire SoC, the latest and greatest, sampling now. So PolarFire SoC is the result of Microchip collaborating with partners Sci-Fi and Ultra SoC, where they've enabled a RISC-V based innovation platform. And I know that's a bit marketing, but you'll really see how flexible and what it can do when you start to dig into it. Because for the first time, you can now run Linux and a real-time application side by side in a deterministic and coherent CPU cluster, which allows developers to use the richness of Linux or another OS in a deterministic fashion to innovate towards doing whatever they want, securing their IoT, integrating safety critical parameters, all in an integrated chip that's leveraging the class leading low power of PolarFire FPGA. So we'll look at the architecture real quick. You'll see that there's 5 RISC-V cores. One is used as the monitor core. this does your system level services. It's still customizable by the user, but most of the functions are pretty well predetermined. It's just about using that core to implement the functions that your application needs. The other 4 cores are user available and can be used however you want. These all connect through a coherent switch to either the fabric on the bottom, or as it shows you, the deterministic L2 memory subsystem. There's I/O that are available directly to the RISC-V cores and to the fabric. And then the 2 blocks in the top left are worth noting. There's 128K of boot flash available, which is usually completely sufficient for getting your boot code in there. And for some applications, but in a quad core processor, likely not. But for some applications, it might hold all of your code. And also, the Igloo 2 and SmartFusion 2 products, the previous generations, were so successful with their utilization for secure boot, mostly the SmartFusion 2, that they actually put a hard secure boot block in PolarFire SoC. So I kind of said I was done with power, but that was in PolarFire. What's worth showing here is that this slide to the right actually shows a power, a performance per watt advantage, while not comparing apples to apples, but actually showing superior features of the PolarFire SoC compared to the competition. So DDR4 versus DDR3, 12 versus 6 gig SerDes, more PCIe, I/O, and DSP and RAM resources, and in a smaller package. And yet we still get a performance versus power advantage. So for security and reliability, it's pretty simple. I mentioned it earlier on the quiz, right? For power, security, and reliability, best in class. PolarFire SoC inherits the PolarFire FPGA security features, which consist of TPA resistant bit streams, anti-tamper, supply chain assurance, PUFs, TRNGs, and also side channel resistant crypto coprocessor. But in addition to that, the PolarFire SoC adds a few things. As we talked about earlier, put in a hard block for standard secure boot or a user-defined secure boot. It has the hooks in place for Spectre and meltdown immunity, and also provides a true physical memory protection. So they built on good and ended up better. For reliability, it's very simple. The nature of being flash-based means that we have 0 fits or failure in tests. So we have an SEU neutron immune configuration fabric. So you don't have any fits, and everybody else has some. And you might not realize this, but even at ground level, failure in tests can happen. It's not just for avionic applications where you're flying in an airplane, or even crazier for low orbit space applications. Fits happen. And then in addition to that, for reliability, every MSS memory has single event correction and double event detection, where the exceptions are identified, generated, and then passed to the fabric for your application to respond however it wants to, whether that's a flush, whether that's a reboot, whether that's grabbing from a golden image. So here's that table. So here's slide number 3. If you pick the PolarFire family, you look at that table. If you want SoC for PolarFire SoC, you got this one. And as you'll see, that ask for smaller densities was received because we've actually got an 025. So this family in PolarFire SoC goes from 23,000 logic elements up to 461,000 logic elements. But what you'll probably notice, and hopefully notice if you look at the 2 tables, there's a bunch of similarities for the math blocks, your RAM, for your DLL and PLL counts, and your high-speed I/O. That's because on a given density to the PolarFire. And that's because PolarFire SoC is built on PolarFire FPGA. There's a ton of applications, but going back to one of the beginning things that we talked about, this edge compute platform is a really good use case that I just wanted to show to you, because it shows you again how you can have the lockstep interaction between a processor running a real-time OS and a hard FPGA compute engine to implement a deterministic control with signal processing or other. And the MiFi ecosystem, it's basically the RISC-V ecosystem is MiFi. And it's very comprehensive. It just doesn't give you really sweet CPUs with the RISC-V. It provides the design tools, the various OS support. It has boards, solutions, and then also provides the design support for you to be successful. And we're in the getting started, we'll cover a lot of this collateral that's available. So Harold and I thought this might seem a little disruptive, but we really thought that providing this one slide on the soft console on the Libero tool flows would be helpful to understand how the tools work together to develop your product. So soft console is Microchip's software development platform for SoCs, and Libero is the FPGA hardware development tool. So what you'll see in the middle there is a standalone MSS configurator. This configurator is used, this tool is used to create a custom configuration or implementation of those 5 cores and all the system and services associated with them for your application. So then what comes out of the MSS configurator is fed to the software flow and fed to the hardware flow as shown here. So on the top, you have the software flow where the configuration data is provided to the software flow, where either soft console or a third-party IDE, which we support, will build the end application. And then the output of that is a set of memory clients that are either integrated into the bit stream of the FPGA or managed in external memory elements, or both, for whatever it is that you want to do with your application. And then on the bottom, Libero, the hardware FPGA tools, simply receives the MSS configurator component and just treats it like any other block in their design. It might be the main block in the design, or it just might be one of them of many. And then the FPGA designer follows a typical flow where they compile their design, generate a bit stream, married in with the final memory management of where everything's going to sit for these configurations in the software and the hardware, and gives you your output. So we thought this was worth including, and I hope you agree. So that really, with that, it completes the introduction to the PolarFire FPGA and PolarFire SoC. So now what I'd like to do, and hopefully this goes smoothly, is a quick sound check to make sure. Are you guys still hearing me? Can somebody come back with something?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent. So now what I'd like to do, Harold kindly put together a technology demo, and let's make sure that that comes together. And please, if you cannot hear it, let me know.
Hi, my name is Harold Nelson. I'm the Microchip FAE for the Southeast US and South America. Glad you guys are watching today, and I'm going to review the Microchip MPF 300 video board and give you a good idea of what the board is capable of doing. So this is a blown up picture of the MPF 300 video card showing the HDMI connections, the USB 12 volt power in, the 2 cameras that are connected via the FMC connector. And all this is documented at the website right there. And you can see some of the features that are on the board, and then the deliverables that come with the kit, the design guide, the design files, the GUI installer, etc. So I wanted to highlight that, and the other thing I wanted to highlight was this is our design flow tool, Libro, and what you'll notice is it's a GUI-based flow. It also provides a Tickle interface for users that want to automate the design using Tickle. And the four or five main tabs on here, I'm showing the design flow, everything from design entry to synthesis, place and route, etc. Over here is the design hierarchy of the MPF 300 video board that we'll be showing today, and it provides both a HDL hierarchy as well as using the smart design blocks. You can actually have more of a visual connection, if you will, between your IP. So what I'm showing here is this is the top level of the design with the various interfaces. We've got a soft processor, a MIPS-5 processor, so you can see the JTAG core, for example, the core itself, which is a MIPS-5 core, and then the various AMBA interfaces that go along with that. And then lastly, a video pipelining block. Um, so just high-level view of how that all works out, and of course simulation capability is built in, and then there's a complete catalog of IP, most of which is free to use, but there's some of the higher-end IP blocks that may need to be licensed. But so that just gives you a brief overview of the tool we'll be using. The Libro tool itself can be downloaded from the Microchip website. It's free. All that's required is to register on the website, and those tools can be downloaded and installed and a license provided once registration is complete. And so you get free to try out this design yourself and simulate it, etc. With that, we'll move on to the next step and start experimenting with the board. So for today's demo, what I'm showing right here is the video board itself. I've already gone in and connected up the 12-volt DC power supply, the USB cable that's used to connect to my PC, and I've got an HDMI cable. Normally, I would connect the HDMI cable directly to my monitor here for an in-live person demo. But for today, I've actually got the HDMI cable connected to my USB port on my PC via an HDMI to USB converter, and I'm going to do that for the convenience of being able to show the output of the HDMI channel directly on my PC for the purpose of this seminar. So that's our hardware overview. And with that, I will go ahead and go through a demo of the software GUI and just give you a brief idea of what this board's capable of doing. One thing you will notice on the board itself is this is the actual FPGA here in the middle. You'll notice there's no heat sink needed for it, and there's also no fan needed because it's very low power. And we'll be doing some live processing, if you will, of HDMI traffic and applying different filtering techniques and that sort of thing on the fly. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so what we see on my screen is the two panes of interest. One is the GUI for the video control. This is showing a connection to the USB interface with the green icon. And you see the various controls that I'll be going over for the GUI. And then over here on the other side, we have two images. The smaller image is bouncing around the screen, and behind that is the other image from the other camera. So just to refresh, we have two HDMI cameras on the video board, and these are the two outputs. So the next thing I'm going to go through is show you the flexibility and the control that is offered via the GUI. So the first thing that's sort of fun to play with is the alpha blending. So you'll notice the smaller PIP picture as it's bouncing around the screen. If I reduce the alpha setting, uh, that image slowly recedes to the background and can be made to disappear or to come back toward the foreground. So that's what that control is all about. Then of course you've got your standard video controls for contrast, brightness. So I'll just sort of play with those a little bit here real time to show some of the processing that can be done all in the FPGA. Brightness. And then of course you've got your RGB color balancing that you can experiment with. So I'll just go through a quick demo here of the RGB. Red, green, and then blue. And then as far as the PIP image itself, if I click on the PIP menu, I can stop it and freeze it where it is. I can actually manually move it around. And you can change cameras from one to the other. And of course you can start it back up again. Go faster or slower. So that's the overview of the window itself. There's also a histogram feature here that I won't be going over today, but that's to plot the intensity of the individual pixels and to experiment with that. And then the panning control, as I showed earlier. And then there's one other thing that I wanted to highlight today, and that's going to be the filtering. And down here in the lower part of the GUI, you see the bare and the edge selection. And this is fairly handy and informative view that gives you the edge detection of the objects in the background. And once again, with edge detection and with bare. So that concludes this portion of the GUI control and the video demo itself, and we'll move on to the next step.
Yeah, so thanks, Harold. That kit is really excellent. If you have a video application, I would strongly consider getting that kit. You know, that GUI is meant to help development. So when you're seeing all those parameters working within the IP, you're able to leverage how those settings are done, understand how the settings within the device work, and bring them into your application. So good stuff, and thank you, Harold. So last but not least, let's see. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to provide some getting started resources. Again, these are meant to help you decloud what might be pretty intimidating on the front end. There's a lot of resources in place, and we wanted to provide some insight into how to use what they are and how to use them to streamline your development, save time to market, minimize risk, all of those advantages. There's a lot of win-wins in knowing what resources are available. So I'm going to cover these slides pretty quickly, but they'll be there for you to reference when you need them. So first, Microchip University. So I can't say there's a lot of phenomenalness that's come out of COVID. There's some goodness there, though, if you're a half full person like myself. But many of you might remember Microchip Masters, which had to go virtual last year. Well, some of the goodness that came out of that is Microchip University, where we've created a bunch of on-demand courses and webcasts across all of Microchip's products, and it continues to build. It's currently over 50. Here's a link to Microchip University. These are on demand to anyone. And I've also got a link here to the subset of FPGA and SoC courses and webcasts that you can take. And YouTube, so often overlooked, because if we're really honest, most of the time, technology YouTube videos are more marketing, right? It's like, hey, check out our super cool widget. It's awesome. Nobody else is as awesome as ours. But in this case, especially for PolarFire and PolarFire SoC, our latest generations, the team really took it serious to put out valuable, informative, manageable sized segments of information. So there's a ton of videos. I have a link at the top there to all of them. But what I really want you to take a peek is, and I thought this was really a great utilization of playlists. Basically, they took all those different videos and compiled valuable playlists for a given topic. So in the background on the right, you'll see just some of the playlists that are available. And the numbers in the dark squares show you how many videos are associated with those. Then I just brought one forward. For example, the bare metal application. This comprises of 6 different videos that you can watch as needed. You don't have to watch all of them. A quick video on an introduction to doing a bare metal application targeting DDR, how to create that application, how to build the HSS and program the EMDM, another video on generating a payload, or suppose you're going to be targeting eMMC instead of EMDM, and you'll want to watch the programming the eMMC video. So you get the gist here. So basically, for PolarFire and PolarFire SoC, that's when really the marketing kind of slid out. Trust me, there's still marketing videos on this page as well. But in particular, the technology, check out the playlists, and I think you'll find a lot of value. It'll really mature the kind of questions that you have when you reach out to your local resources. So you've looked at those, that first slide I told you that helps you pick the right family. Well, then the next thing you want to do is pick the right board. This does not list all of the boards. The slide does not. The link at the top, though, will take you to a landing page that does list all of the available eval boards. And you can filter them down based on technology or products. But what I did list here is some of the key ones and most popular ones in the products we've been talking about today. There's segment-based kits like the dual motor control and the smart embedded vision. And then there's product-based kits like the latest SoC Icicle kit, or you'll see that PolarFire video and imaging kit that we just did the demo on. So pick an eval board and then order it as quick as you can, because if you haven't heard, lead times right now are less than awesome. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but once you've identified what you need to use, get that order in. And then move on to the next step. So while you've ordered the board in the happy world, you now are ready to get the tools. And as I mentioned earlier, there's 2 primary tools. You have the Libero SoC FPGA tools, which have free versions. It really depends what device you're using. And there's a nice table at that link that'll tell you which tool versions, free or not free, support parts and features. And then you have the Smart Console software tools, which are completely free. Or you can get, if you're using, as we mentioned, a third-party IAR or Kyle for your software flow. So while you're downloading, so you've got your board on order, and now you're downloading your tools, slide on over to this other link for the intellectual property. This link will get you to the top level intellectual property for FPGA's landing page. Please reference it, because I'm going to tell you, when you're looking for that landing page on our website right now, it's not going to jump out at you. But once you're there, it's easy to use. All right, you're going to see that the IP is divided into 2 classes of device. You have your direct core and your companion core. Direct core IP are developed by and supported by Microchip. The companion cores are developed by and supported by third parties. However, they are vetted and approved by Microchip. Also on that landing page is a very important resource. It's a spreadsheet that you can download that lists all of the cores. It'll tell you what products they support. It'll tell you whether they're free, and if they're not free, it'll tell you the price, and it'll give you the part number of the individual IPs. So when you're reaching out to your counterparts and asking questions, that resource will get you there. And lastly, and with good time, leverage the reference designs. As I mentioned earlier when talking about the 3 key markets, there's collateral in place, there's demo designs, there's reference designs. They can be targeting a part, a tool, or a board. They're located either under your documentation tab on a product page, as is shown over to the right, where you see the DSP and you see the demo guides, or especially in the case of PolarFire SoC, we're using GitHub to manage a lot of the resources, which is great. So there's a link to the GitHub there, and then an example link to some of the landing pages for the products shown at the bottom. So that really concludes the presentation. So I want to say thank you. And before we get into Q&A though, I want to take one more minute. We've compiled an appendix for you, an additional 35 slides, and I'm not going to walk through them all now, but they're after this slide here, where they will provide some additional slides that show the key advantages, additional tool information that will be helpful, and then the product tables and architectures for all the other families that we talked about in the beginning, but we didn't cover, which is basically everything except for PolarFire FPGAs and PolarFire SoCs. And then there's a few miscellaneous that Harold and I thought would be helpful. So I'm not sure how this will show up as I page down through 35 slides and then it disappears. But let me present one more time and say thank you. Before, we really appreciate this opportunity to share information with you. We're excited about the technology, and our whole team looks forward to helping you however we can be successful. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions. And Harold and I will go video live. I'll stop presenting and we'll answer whatever we can.
Thank you, Keith. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I'm sure if Pablo he might have a few.
No, we don't have any question in the YouTube channel, so I don't know, Mauricio, if you want to say something.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So thank you very much, guys. There are no questions, but if any questions comes along later on, I will make sure to forward it to you and get it answered. Okay.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.